Greetings and welcome once again to Pyats Fortress. As mentioned in my previous installment, in this episode we're going to wind up the Great Midwestern Fandom Freakout Tour that took up the last 3 or 4 episodes with a visit to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which is the home of the late Gary Gygax, who was the creator of Dungeons & Dragons, and also the town which served as the cradle for the development of the game and of the hobby of tabletop role-playing games. The town actually still has a significant connection to tabletop gaming, being the home of Dragonlance author Margaret Weiss and the headquarters of her game publishing company. Now, my original intent was to produce this episode around the first anniversary of Gary Gygax's death, which occurred in March of 2008. However, I find that that memorial date has been superseded by the news of Dave Arneson's death last week at the age of 61. Arneson was the co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons, and in fact the man who might be said to have invented the hobby of tabletop gaming. He was running role-playing games before Dungeons & Dragons existed in the late 60s, early 70s. I saw him very briefly at Gen Con one year, and was pleased to see gamers taking the time out to thank him for everything he'd done for the hobby. Arneson was never as much in the limelight as Gary Gygax, but was certainly no less influential, perhaps some would say more influential in the development of the hobby. Well, Arneson did not live in Lake Geneva. He certainly played a major part in the development of Dungeons & Dragons and the subsequent evolution of the hobby. And, well, with that, let's go now to Lake Wisconsin on a clear and cold November day. The ride-up from Chicago was uneventful and mildly picturesque. There are dozens of little lakes and small towns along the way between Chicago and Lake Geneva. We, which is to say myself and my friend Andy, who was driving, did stop in one town involuntarily after being pulled over by a suspicious state trooper, who was a little nonplussed to find this Volkswagen Golf with out-of-state plates being driven by someone with a license from yet another state, with a Canadian passenger, neither of whom had any idea where to find the license and registration. This enforced stop actually allowed me to try a local brand of root beer, which unfortunately tasted like turpentine. Given how dusty the bottle was, though, I won't assume that it tastes like this all the time. There was actually a local restaurant which creates the stuff, or at least, bottles and sells it, I suppose, which seemed like a really sort of fine place to dine if you really like a cheese dog and disco fries, though unfortunately it was closed for the season. We made it to Lake Geneva in good time and quickly found the first stop on our tour. We are in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. We're standing for Donald Kay's house. This was the first site of Technical Studies rules back in the early 70s. This is where the first copies of Dungeons & Dragons were put together in the basement of this house and distributed at the Horticultural Hall at the first Gen, or not the first Gen Con, but one of the first Gen Cons. We're going to look at that in a minute, but first we're going to go to Gary Gygax's house. Right.
You're on.
Oh, hello, yes. We're still in Lake Geneva. We're on Center Street now, and we're actually beside Gary Gygax's old house. This is the house he lived in when he was running Greyhawk, when Dragon magazine was first launched. As a matter of fact, this house actually was the... Oh, come along this way, hold a look at it. This house was where Dragon magazine became Dragon magazine's international headquarters after Gary Gygax moved out, I believe. I'll have a fact check on that, though. But here we are. This is where the first sessions of Dungeons & Dragons were run, I believe, back in the early 1970s. Lake Geneva is a pleasant, compact town, clearly something of a regional center. We wandered up and down the side streets, pausing at a souvenir store where I got a mug. And we wished the Medusa Grill was open. We did continue to get eyeballed by a policeman who cruised by us a couple of times, possibly suspecting us of a plan to blow up the historic agricultural hall. Speaking of which, let's go there now. Go. Hello! Hi everyone again. Wait for the crowd to pass. As I said, we were at the Horticultural Hall. It was here in 1974 that the very first public games of Dungeons & Dragons were played. The very first copies went on sale at Gen Con 1974. The Horticultural Hall was actually the site of Gen Con from 1968 until 1977, and after that moved to a university site after it outgrew. It's a beautiful building, but very small. This is where the first adventures were had, the world first learned of Dungeons & Dragons. Though not curiously, the site of the first role-playing games, and that could be the topic of another Fortress of Solitude. That actually took place in 1967. And so long now from Lake Geneva. Before we left Lake Geneva, we stopped for supper at the next door pub and pizzeria, noted as a former haunt of TSR staff in the 80s and 90s. Andy and I split a Geneva Meat Monster pizza and a pitcher of Sprackler root beer with a happy little griffin as the logo. There's no word on the hit dice of the Meat Monster or the Griffin. We drove back to Chicago and rejoined our convention, and that concludes my coverage of the Great Midwest Fandom Freakout of 2008. I hope to embark on a similar road trip in the fall of this year, and until then, well, until next time, I'll hopefully be back before then, good night, God bless, and stay fortified.